China, the mid-1960s. A nation born from revolution now teeters on the brink of chaos once more. The world watches as one man, Chairman Mao Zedong, prepares to unleash the most destructive social upheaval of the 20th century, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. What started as a political power play would spiral into a decade of purges, persecution, and unrelenting terror. By 1965, the People's Republic of China stood at a critical crossroads. Less than 2 decades earlier, Mao had led the Communist Party to a decisive victory against Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists in a brutal civil war. That triumph in 1949 had elevated Mao to a godlike status. He wasn't just a leader, he was the great helmsman, the ideological father of a new socialist China. But beneath the surface of this revolutionary paradise, deep cracks were forming. The catastrophic failure of the Great Leap Forward, Mao's ambitious plan to rapidly industrialize the country, had plunged China into a devastating famine. Tens of millions perished. This disaster severely damaged Mao's prestige and sparked doubts within the Communist Party about his judgment. More pragmatic leaders, like Liu Shaoqi, Zhou Enlai, and Deng Xiaoping, began to steer China towards a more moderate path, advocating for recovery through practical economic reforms. To Mao, this was nothing short of betrayal. He saw their pragmatism as the rebirth of bourgeois tendencies, the creeping shadow of capitalism threatening the purity of his revolution. And Mao could not tolerate any deviation from his ideology. The revolution, he believed, was not over. It was decaying from within. As his influence dwindled in the early 1960s, Mao stepped back from the political front lines. But in the quiet solitude of Zhongnanhai, the walled compound of China's rulers, he was plotting his comeback. He would reclaim his dominance not through policy, but through passion, chaos, and the fiery energy of the masses. He would once again turn the people into his weapon. The seeds of the Cultural Revolution were sown not in the corridors of power, but on the battlefield of ideas. Mao believed that socialism's survival depended on perpetual struggle, a constant war of thought, class, and belief. In 1965, his loyal ally, Lin Biao, the Minister of Defense, began promoting Mao's Little Red Book, a pocket-sized collection of the chairman's quotations. Soldiers were ordered to memorize Mao's words as if they were gospel. This wasn't just propaganda, it was preparation. Lin was methodically building a cult of personality that transcended politics, a new religion with Mao as its messiah. Then came the catalyst. In late 1965, a literary critic named Yao Wenyuan, acting on Mao's orders, published a scathing attack on a play called The Dismissal of Hai Rui. The play, written by Beijing's deputy mayor Wu Han, was a historical drama about an honest official punished for speaking truth to power. Mao's loyalists immediately interpreted it as a veiled criticism of Mao's own dismissal of General Peng Dehuai, who had dared to oppose the Great Leap Forward. The attack on Wu Han was no minor literary dispute. It was a signal, a coded declaration of war. Mao had found his new weapon, culture. Through art, literature, and education, he would root out what he called bourgeois poison. This new revolution wouldn't be fought with rifles, but with ideology. In May 1966, the Central Committee issued a document that would forever change China, the May 16th Circular. It declared that the Communist Party was infested with revisionists, enemies disguised as comrades, and it called for a nationwide purge to cleanse the ranks. Mao's words thundered across the country. To overthrow a class, one must first seize its ideology. The Cultural Revolution had officially begun. That summer, universities across China exploded. Students, inflamed by Mao's revolutionary call, organized themselves into militant youth groups known as the Red Guards. They saw themselves as soldiers of ideology, the chosen defenders of Mao's pure vision. At massive rallies in Beijing, Mao appeared before millions at Tiananmen Square, dressed in a simple military uniform, waving to the roaring crowds. To these young people, he was immortal. To question Mao was to betray the revolution itself. The Red Guards took his words literally. Across the nation, they launched attacks on symbols of old China, temples, books, artworks, and priceless cultural relics, anything tied to tradition or intellectualism. Teachers, scholars, and even their own parents were denounced as capitalist roaders. Ancient Confucian ideals, once revered as the heart of Chinese civilization, were now branded as poisonous remnants of a feudal past. Walls everywhere were covered with posters known as dazibao, exposing supposed traitors and counter-revolutionaries. People were dragged into public squares, forced to wear placards of shame around their necks, and brutally beaten into giving false confessions. The Red Guard's slogan echoed through the chaos: "Destroy the old world, build the new world." Schools closed their doors. Universities dissolved. Knowledge was no longer a path to wisdom, it was a threat. The intellectual elite of China, the scientists, professors, and artists who had been the nation's pride, were publicly humiliated, tortured, or sent to the countryside for brutal re-education through labor. By late 1966, the Cultural Revolution had transformed into an uncontrollable wildfire, and Mao stood atop the inferno smiling. What others saw as destruction, he called rebirth. As the movement grew, it turned inward. The Cultural Revolution wasn't just an attack on the past, it became a war within the Communist Party itself. High-ranking officials, once Mao's trusted comrades, were now branded as enemies of the state. President Liu Shaoqi, the man who had temporarily taken over leadership after the Great Leap Forward, was accused of being China's Khrushchev. He was publicly humiliated, imprisoned, and later died in horrific conditions, denied basic medical care. Deng Xiaoping, another senior leader, was purged twice, forced to perform hard labor and watch his family suffer. Countless others simply vanished into prisons or were executed without a trial. Even those closest to Mao were not safe. Power struggles erupted within the Red Guard factions themselves, as different groups clashed violently over who represented true Maoist thought. Cities turned into battlegrounds. The army itself was divided, torn between loyalty to local commanders and to Mao's central authority. The chaos spiraled so deep that by 1967, China was no longer a functioning state, but a nation consumed by a storm of anarchy. And in the midst of this turmoil, Mao made his move. He had successfully used chaos to destroy his political enemies, and now he would restore order, under his sole, absolute command. In 1969, the Ninth Party Congress declared the Cultural Revolution a great success. Lin Biao, the man who helped create Mao's cult of personality, was officially named Mao's heir apparent. But even this victory would soon turn to paranoia. Mao, consumed by suspicion, began to doubt Lin's loyalty. In 1971, the nation was stunned when Lin Biao died in a mysterious plane crash while allegedly fleeing China after a failed coup plot against Mao. The event shattered the myth of pure loyalty that the movement was built on and deepened the sense of dread across the country. The revolution was devouring its own. By the early 1970s, millions had been persecuted. Intellectuals, officials, and ordinary citizens lived under a constant, paralyzing fear of denunciation. Families turned against each other. Children betrayed their parents, all in the name of ideology. Entire generations lost their education, their childhoods, their hope. China's vast cultural heritage, its libraries, temples, art, and architecture, was decimated. The psychological scars would last for decades. Yet through it all, Mao remained untouchable. To the masses, he was the architect of destiny, a man whose every decision was beyond question. To his inner circle, however, he was aging, fragile, and increasingly isolated. The storm he had unleashed was now slipping beyond even his control. As the fires of revolution consumed a nation, the chairman's red dream had become a nightmare painted in blood. The Cultural Revolution was no longer an idea. It was a living, breathing chaos. And as China descended deeper into... By 1967, the Cultural Revolution had reached a fevered intensity. What started as Chairman Mao Zedong's grand vision to renew China's revolutionary spirit was now a nationwide test of loyalty, ideology, and sheer endurance. The dream of ideological purity had morphed into a national struggle, and its consequences would reshape an entire generation. As the revolution gained momentum, the initial enthusiasm began to curdle into confusion. Across the vastness of China, different groups competed to interpret Mao's words, each claiming to represent the truest form of his thought. Factories slowed, schools closed their doors, and universities became battlegrounds for debate rather than centers of learning. It was as if the entire country had paused, caught between a radical transformation and a profound uncertainty. In workplaces and neighborhoods, meetings stretched late into the night. Ordinary citizens were asked to examine their deepest beliefs, to question whether their loyalty to the cause was absolute. Some stepped forward eagerly, embracing the chance to prove their devotion. Others struggled, lost in a sea of shifting expectations. The revolution wasn't just about politics. It was a battle for the human conscience. Amid this tension, friendships fractured, and even families grew cautious with one another. The very definition of faith and devotion was being rewritten, day by day. By the middle of 1967, even Mao Zedong realized that passion alone could not sustain a nation. The spontaneous, chaotic energy he had unleashed was now threatening the stability of the state itself. To restore a sense of direction, Mao turned to the institution he trusted most: the People's Liberation Army. The army was called in to guide the country back toward discipline and unity. The young, idealistic students who had once dominated the streets were now encouraged to redirect their energy toward productive work and rural development. This marked the beginning of a vast campaign known as the Down to the Countryside movement. Millions of students packed their bags and left the cities, carrying notebooks instead of revolutionary banners. They were sent to remote villages, not as a punishment, but as an opportunity. A chance to learn from the peasants and experience the very foundation of China as socialist identity. For many, this was a moment of deep reflection. The countryside became both a classroom and a mirror, a place where the high-minded ideals of revolution collided with the hard realities of daily life. As society adjusted to this new rhythm, Mao began to turn his focus inward, toward the Communist Party itself. He believed the ultimate success of the revolution depended on purifying the party of self-interest and ideological complacency. This internal campaign brought intense scrutiny upon some of the most senior officials. Debates grew fierce, and disagreements that had once been private were suddenly thrust into the national spotlight. One of Mao's oldest comrades, President Liu Xiaoqi, who had long advocated for practical economic recovery after the Great Leap Forward, became the center of this ideological controversy. Another prominent leader, Deng Xiaoping, known for his pragmatic reforms, also faced sharp criticism. These men weren't enemies of the state. They were symbols of an older, more moderate way of thinking that Mao felt was holding China back. Mao wasn't necessarily seeking their destruction, but rather the reaffirmation of his revolutionary vision. Yet, their removal from the political stage left a deep, unnerving silence in the halls of power. The revolution, it seemed, demanded not blood, but unwavering belief. To survive in those years was to prove again and again one's total understanding of Mao's thought. By 1969, Mao Zedong's image had become inseparable from the identity of the nation. His quotations filled every newspaper. His portraits adorned every wall. In schools, children learned his words by heart, and workers recited them before beginning their day. The Little Red Book, a collection of his quotations compiled under the guidance of Defense Minister Lin Biao, became both a moral compass and a daily ritual. To quote Mao was to speak with authority. To question him was simply unthinkable. Mao was no longer just the leader of China. He was the living symbol of its destiny. The Ninth Party Congress of 1969 celebrated the Cultural Revolution as a monumental triumph. Lin Biao, whose devotion to Mao was considered unmatched, was officially named his successor. Yet, even in this moment of apparent unity, faint shadows were beginning to appear. Power had been reconsolidated around Mao, but a quiet suspicion remained, a subtle unease that loyalty, no matter how fervent, could one day falter. Just 2 years later, in 1971, China awoke to shocking news. Lin Biao, the man once described as Mao's closest comrade in arms, was dead under mysterious circumstances. The official report claimed that Lin had attempted to flee China after allegedly plotting against Mao. His plane had crashed in Mongolia, leaving behind a void filled with uncertainty and rumor. The event sent ripples of shock and confusion through the nation. For years, Lin Biao had embodied loyalty itself. His sudden downfall suggested that even within Mao's inner circle, trust was fragile. The revolution had revealed its most profound and unsettling truth. In a movement built on absolute belief, doubt was the one thing no one could afford. The government quietly worked to reassure the public, urging unity and calm. propaganda shifted from triumphant celebration to quiet contemplation. The people were reminded that the revolution was about ideals, not individuals. But behind the scenes, the atmosphere grew introspective. Mao, aging and increasingly cautious, became more reflective about the turbulent course his revolution had taken. By the early 1970s, China stood on the edge of another great transformation. The Cultural Revolution had fundamentally changed the nation's social fabric, but the world beyond its borders was also shifting. The Cold War was raging between the Soviet Union and the United States, and China began to chart its own independent path. Seeking to break out of its diplomatic isolation, Mao made a bold and unexpected move. He extended a hand to the West. In 1972, the world watched in astonishment as U.S. President Richard Nixon arrived in Beijing. The image of Chairman Mao meeting President Nixon symbolized a dramatic new chapter. Not one of surrender, but of brilliant strategy. It was diplomacy through paradox. The revolutionary leader of the East shaking hands with the leading representative of Western capitalism. But Mao saw beyond ideology. He saw the global balance of power. The meeting repositioned China on the world stage, signaling that the revolution was entering a new phase, one where survival required engagement, not isolation. After 1972, Mao's health began to visibly decline. He appeared less frequently in public, his speeches grew fewer, and his movements slower. Yet his aura remained undimmed. His mere presence still commanded reverence. During this time, new figures rose to prominence. Among them was Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, along with her close associates, who would later be known as the Gang of Four. They positioned themselves as the guardians of Mao's legacy, taking control of culture, media, and ideology. Revolutionary operas and patriotic films replaced traditional art forms, all emphasizing moral clarity and collective devotion. For the Chinese people, however, a deep fatigue had set in. Years of constant political campaigning had left many yearning for stability and a return to normalcy. Yet, open discussion remained guarded. The revolution still defined public life, even as its initial fiery energy had begun to fade. The nation, and the world, held its breath, waiting to see what would come after the man who had shaped modern China. By 1972, China had weathered 6 years of immense transformation. The Cultural Revolution, once a storm of ideological passion, was entering a new phase. The intense fire that had consumed culture and tradition now simmered, giving way to a more subtle, yet equally compelling struggle for power, influence, and the very soul of China's future. At the center of it all was Chairman Mao Zedong. Now in his late 70s, his health was visibly failing, but his presence was as powerful as ever. His portrait hung in every classroom, factory, and public square. The words in his little red book were still the guide for daily life and thought. Despite his age, Mao's political mind was sharp. He watched the shifting alliances within the Communist Party, knowing the revolution he started would outlive him. For Mao, this was never just political theater. It was a profound test of the nation's resilience and loyalty. In private, Mao conferred with a tight circle of aides. Among them was his wife, Jiang Qing, whose power over cultural policy had grown immense. Alongside her stood Jiang Chunqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen. History would come to know them as the Gang of Four. They became the staunch enforcers of Maoist orthodoxy, overseeing everything from theater and literature to media and education. They made sure every form of cultural expression towed the revolutionary line. Traditional opera, classical literature, and Western-influenced arts were swept aside, replaced by new works that championed collective values, unwavering loyalty, and moral certainty. Their approach was less about the overt violence of the early years, and more about careful management. Public performances, schools, and publications were meticulously combed for ideological purity. Propaganda was elevated to an art form. Loyalty to Mao became not just a political duty, but a cultural and intellectual practice. Citizens were encouraged to embody the revolution in their everyday actions: diligence, self-discipline, and collective responsibility. It was a quieter, more disciplined reflection of the revolution's ultimate goals. While the domestic focus was on revolutionary ideals, Mao also understood the importance of China's place on the world stage. The groundbreaking visit of U.S. President Richard Nixon in 1972 had been a masterclass in strategic diplomacy. Mao and his advisors knew that ideological strength at home had to be balanced with a pragmatic presence abroad. China began to cautiously engage with international partners, balancing its revolutionary identity with the need for economic and political security. It was a delicate dance, projecting an image of a revolutionary bastion, while subtly reshaping its global strategy through quiet negotiations. Mao's China was now both a symbol of revolutionary ideals and a pragmatic player in global politics. Within China itself, a sense of stability began to return. The radical fervor of the late 1960s was replaced by routines shaped by revolutionary principles. Schools reopened, their curricula focused on ideological alignment and practical skills, weaving in lessons on history, ethics, and collective duty. Many of the young people who had been sent down to the countryside during the earlier, more chaotic years began to return, contributing to agricultural projects, building infrastructure, and participating in local government. The nation was rebuilding itself, not through force, but through reflection, labor, and the quiet application of revolutionary ideals to everyday life. Communities stressed cooperation and mutual support, finding ways to reconcile their past experiences with a cautious hope for the future. But as Mao's health continued to decline, the question of succession loomed larger. Who would carry the torch? The Gang of Four worked tirelessly to solidify their influence, aiming to ensure Mao's vision would endure after he was gone. They carefully guided younger officials and consolidated their hold on cultural and political institutions. For aspiring leaders, it was a time of navigating the subtle politics of loyalty and ideological correctness. The balance of power was incredibly fragile. Too much independence could be seen as a betrayal of Mao's principles, but too little stifled the initiative needed for practical governance. Leadership was now a test of intellectual stewardship as much as political strength. By 1975, the Cultural Revolution was in its final phase. The Gang of Four intensified their efforts to codify revolutionary values in art, literature, and education. Cautious economic and administrative reforms were explored, always weighing practical needs against ideological commitment. The nation was moving toward a new kind of stability, but uncertainty remained. Who would succeed Mao? Would his policies continue? How would the country interpret his legacy? The answers were just over the horizon. In 1976, the twilight of an era arrived. Mao's health deteriorated sharply. He spent his final months in the quiet of the Zhongnanhai leadership compound, his public appearances becoming rare and ceremonial. Yet, his influence was undiminished. Schools, workplaces, and cultural life all operated under the principles he had laid down. Even in his absence, Mao's shadow loomed large over the nation. His words were studied, his decisions analyzed, his vision upheld. Between 1972 and 1976, China walked a tightrope. It was a period where quiet reflection replaced radical action, where ideology was carefully cultivated rather than violently imposed. The nation had endured the storm, learned resilience, and was now preparing for a future without its paramount leader. The Cultural Revolution's raw energy had matured, leaving behind a society deeply conscious of its ideals and its collective identity. But as Mao's life drew to a close, the final chapter of the revolution remained unwritten. How would the nation navigate the immense vacuum left by his passing? What role would the Gang of Four play in the post-Mao era? And how would the Chinese people reconcile decades of ideological struggle with the practical realities of daily life? The answers were coming in the momentous year of 1976, when the curtain would finally fall on the Cultural Revolution. By the summer of 1976, the rhythm of China had slowed. The powerful chants of revolution, which once echoed through every city and village, now existed as faint memories. The Cultural Revolution had reshaped an entire generation, redefined loyalty, and forever altered the course of Chinese society. Yet, the air carried an unmistakable sense of transition, a silent acknowledgement that the age of Mao Zedong was drawing to its close. Across China, whispers of uncertainty drifted through the corridors of power. The once vigorous Chairman Mao, whose image adorned every classroom and whose words were etched into the nation's consciousness, had grown frail. His health declined steadily, confining him to his residence in Zhongnanhai. But even in his weakened state, Mao's aura remained unshaken. For millions, Mao was not merely a ruler. He was history itself. His ideas were the foundation of a nation rebuilt from ashes. And yet, as his strength waned, so too did the clarity of China's direction. Inside the party, factions whispered of succession. The Gang of Four, Jiang Qing, Zhang Chunqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen, saw themselves as the keepers of Mao's revolutionary flame. But others, weary of chaos and rigid control, quietly envisioned a different future. Among them was Deng Xiaoping, a figure who would soon emerge from the shadows to reshape China's destiny. In the early days of September 1976, Beijing was heavy with silence. On September 9th, Mao Zedong passed away. The announcement, made through the nation's tightly controlled broadcast network, struck the people like a wave of disbelief. For a generation born and raised under his rule, the death of Mao Zedong was not merely the end of a leader, it was the end of an era. The symbol of revolutionary endurance had departed, leaving behind a country uncertain of how to carry his vision forward. Crowds gathered in Tiananmen Square. Black armbands, white flowers, and banners of mourning filled the streets. Across the nation, factories halted, schools closed, and citizens wept before Mao's portrait. The mourning was both personal and collective, a shared moment of reflection on a life that had reshaped the identity of a billion people. For 10 days, China stood still, filled with grief, reverence, and a quiet fear of what would come next. With Mao's passing, the balance of power shifted rapidly. The Gang of Four moved swiftly, seeking to preserve their control and ensure the Cultural Revolution's ideological structure would continue. Jiang Qing, Mao's widow, believed his spiritual legacy would legitimize their authority. But within the party, opposition was growing. Many officials, exhausted by years of ideological rigidity, sought a return to order and national reconstruction. The nation stood at a crossroads. One path led toward continuing revolutionary fervor, the other toward reform and renewal. The choice would define China's modern identity. Then came October 6, 1976, a turning point. In a carefully orchestrated political maneuver, the Gang of Four were arrested. The operation, swift and silent, was conducted by the leadership loyal to Premier Hua Guofeng, Mao's chosen successor. The announcement marked the symbolic end of the Cultural Revolution. For the first time in over a decade, China exhaled. There were no grand speeches, no mass rallies, no public purges, just quiet reorganization. The revolution that had begun with chants and red flags now ended in silence. In the months that followed, China began to confront the legacy of the past 10 years. Students returned to classrooms, universities reopened, and the focus shifted towards science, engineering, and modernization. Intellectuals who had been sidelined were quietly invited back to contribute to the nation's reconstruction. Cultural institutions cautiously revived traditional arts, literature, and music, weaving them into a new narrative of national resilience. China was awakening, not in defiance of its past, but in acknowledgement of it. The revolution had left scars, but it had also instilled endurance, unity, and a profound understanding of collective strength. Politically, Hua Guofeng initially sought to balance loyalty to Mao with a gradual relaxation of control. His famous slogan, "Whatever Chairman Mao said we shall follow," captured this transitional moment, a cautious bridge between the old and the new. But it was Deng Xiaoping who would soon redefine China's path. In 1977, Deng Xiaoping returned to the political forefront. A man of quiet determination, strategic intellect, and pragmatic vision, Deng had survived multiple political setbacks. Yet his faith in modernization and reform never wavered. He saw China's future not through the lens of ideological campaigns, but through practical growth. Deng's approach was revolutionary in its own right, not through slogans, but through results. He believed that socialism could evolve, that China could open its doors to innovation without abandoning its core identity. By 1978, the seeds of change were sown. The third plenum of the 11th Central Committee marked a decisive shift. The party officially declared the Cultural Revolution a serious error, paving the way for economic reform and opening up to the world. Factories adopted new production methods. Rural areas embraced agricultural reforms. The atmosphere shifted from ideological enforcement to developmental ambition. China was stepping into a new dawn, one that valued progress over purity and pragmatism over passion. Even as the nation moved forward, the echoes of the Cultural Revolution remained deeply embedded in the collective memory. For some, it was a time of unshakable idealism. For others, a period of confusion and restraint. Historians, artists, and scholars began to document the period with quiet honesty, examining what those years had meant, not as condemnation, but as reflection. The Cultural Revolution was not forgotten. It became a mirror. It revealed both the heights of conviction and the depths of human complexity. Through that reflection, China gained something profound: the wisdom of hindsight, the discipline of endurance, and the courage to rebuild. By the late 1970s, a new rhythm defined the nation. Cities buzzed with construction, villages thrived with renewed productivity, and schools once again became places of discovery. China's diplomacy expanded, trade reopened, and the country began to participate more actively in global affairs. The memory of isolation gave way to engagement. The portrait of Mao still hung proudly, but beside it now stood a new vision, one of balance, growth, and adaptation. The revolution had ended, but its lessons endured. It had taught China resilience in the face of adversity, unity amid division, and the power of reflection in the pursuit of progress. History rarely concludes with clarity. It fades, transforms, and reemerges in new forms. The Cultural Revolution, with all its passion and paradox, remains one of the most significant chapters in modern Chinese history. It began with a call to purity and ended with a call to progress. It rose from idealism and concluded in introspection. And though it tested the soul of a nation, it also shaped the foundation for its renewal. As the years passed, China would rise again, not as the land of endless revolution, but as a civilization rediscovering its equilibrium. The era of Mao Zedong had ended, but the echoes of his revolution, the questions it raised, the unity it inspired, the transformation it demanded, would continue to shape China's destiny for generations to come. Every revolution leaves behind its shadow, and within that shadow, a nation finds its light.
The case may be closed, but crimology never sleeps. Like and subscribe to join Crimology and step deeper into the dark with us.